For 6 years, I shared a bed with a woman whose real name I never once heard. Not until a bank teller looked me in the eye.
My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the 6 years I spent building a life on a foundation that was never real, and how everything I thought I understood about my marriage, my family, and myself came apart in a single afternoon. This is not a story about a scandal you read in a tabloid. This is the story of an ordinary man who woke up one day and realized the woman he loved, the woman who shared his bed and raised his children, had been someone else entirely the whole time. I am telling you this because for years I told no one. I carried it alone, convinced that silence was strength. It wasn't. It was just another way of hiding. If you have ever trusted someone completely and been wrong, you already know how this feels before I say another word. It started the way most disasters start, quietly, with nothing that looked like a warning. I met her at a friend's engagement party in a rented banquet hall that smelled like carnations and cheap champagne. She was standing near the dessert table, laughing at something no one else found funny, and I remember thinking that anyone who could laugh like that in a room full of strangers had nothing to hide. That thought would come back to haunt me later, because it turned out laughter was the easiest mask she ever wore. We talked for 2 hours that night. She told me about a childhood in a small town, a father who worked construction, a mother who sewed curtains for extra money. Every detail was specific enough to feel true. I had no reason to doubt a single word. We married 18 months later in a backyard ceremony with string lights and a borrowed sound system. I stood under a wooden arch my brother built and promised to know her, to protect her, to grow old beside her. She cried during her vows, and I remember feeling like the luckiest man in that yard. Looking back now, I understand that some tears are real even when the person crying them is lying about everything else. That is the part that still confuses me most, the idea that a person can feel something genuine in the middle of a fabrication. Maybe you have experienced something similar, a moment where you couldn't tell if the emotion or the story was the lie. The first 2 years were ordinary in the best possible way. We rented a small apartment above a laundromat, argued about whose turn it was to do dishes, and fell asleep most nights with the television still on. She worked as a claims adjuster for an insurance company downtown, or so she told me, leaving every morning at 7:15 dressed in a blazer and low heels. I worked longer hours at a logistics company, coming home tired and grateful for a wife who had dinner waiting more nights than not. We talked about children early, about a house with a yard, about the ordinary architecture of a life two people build together brick by brick. None of it seemed extraordinary. That was exactly the point. By year 3 we had our first child, a daughter with her mother's laugh and my stubborn chin. Money got tighter, sleep got shorter, and the marriage settled into the comfortable exhaustion that anyone with young children understands completely. If you have raised a baby while working full-time, you know there is no energy left over for suspicion. You are simply trying to survive the week. I never once looked for cracks in the foundation because I was too busy holding up my end of the roof. She handled the finances during this period, something I agreed to without much thought because she was better with spreadsheets than I ever was, and because trust, real trust, does not audit its partner like a stranger. Somewhere in year 4, small things started happening that I noticed but did not examine. A phone that stayed face down on the counter. A late arrival home explained by traffic that didn't match the news reports. A new friend from work I never met, mentioned in passing but never invited to dinner. Any one of these things alone means nothing. Marriages are full of small unexplained hours and private phone habits that mean absolutely nothing troubling. I want to be honest with you the way I wish someone had been honest with me. I noticed, and I chose not to look closer, because looking closer felt like an accusation I didn't want to make against a woman I loved. If you are watching this and recognizing your own marriage in these details, I am not telling you to panic. I am telling you to pay attention to the difference between trust and avoidance, because I confused the two for years. There was one evening that fall I still think about often. We were at a neighbor's barbecue, standing near the fence with plastic cups of lemonade. When another guest mentioned a hospital in a city 3 states away, the same city my wife had once told me she'd never set foot in, she laughed and said the man was mistaken, that plenty of hospitals share similar names, and the conversation moved on the way conversations at barbecues do, drifting toward football and property taxes. I remember driving home that night replaying her laugh in my head, trying to decide if it sounded different from her usual laugh, and deciding, because I wanted to decide it, that it sounded exactly the same. That is the strange machinery of denial. It does not silence your doubts. It simply convinces you that noticing them would be unfair to the person you love. Around the same time, our daughter started asking questions about grandparents she had never met, the way children do once they're old enough to notice other families gathering at holidays with aunts and uncles and cousins spilling out of cars. My wife always had an answer ready, a story about a falling out, about relatives too far away to visit, about a childhood she preferred not to dwell on. I accepted these answers the same way I accepted everything else, because a man who loves his family does not treat his wife's grief like a crime scene. I understand now that the details never quite lined up from one telling to the next, a hospital in one version and a car accident in another, but at the time I was not listening for inconsistency. I was listening for reassurance, and reassurance was exactly what she gave me every single time. Year 5 brought our second child, a son, and with him came a level of chaos that buried whatever quiet doubts I had under diapers and daycare pickup schedules. This is also, I would later learn, the year everything nearly came apart, though I had no idea at the time. A woman called our house phone one evening asking for someone by a name I did not recognize, a name that was almost my wife's name, but not quite. I asked my wife about it at dinner, half joking, and she laughed it off as a wrong number, someone looking for a different family entirely. I believed her instantly, the way you believe the person who has never given you a reason not to. That single phone call was the first loose thread, and I let it go without pulling. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the 6th year when the entire structure came down. I had left work early because of a dentist appointment that got canceled, and instead of driving straight home, I stopped at the bank to deposit a check for a side project I had been doing on weekends. The teller pulled up our joint account and mentioned, almost as an aside, that a large transfer had gone out the week before to an account I did not recognize, under a name I had never heard in 6 years of marriage. I stood at that counter in my work clothes, holding a deposit slip, while the teller explained that the transfer had been authorized by my wife using an ID that listed a name that was not hers. Not a nickname, not a maiden name, an entirely different identity. I did not go home that afternoon. Instead, I sat in my car in the bank parking lot for nearly 2 hours, doing something I should have done years earlier. I actually looked. I called the county courthouse in the town where she claimed to have grown up. No record of her family existed there. I searched for her high school, a school she had described in detail down to the mascot and the color of the gymnasium walls, and found that the school had closed 11 years before she said she graduated from it. Every specific detail I had once found so reassuring turned out to be built from nothing at all, a life assembled the way a movie set is assembled, real enough to walk through, hollow the moment you looked behind the walls. When I finally did go home that night, I did not confront her the way you see people do in movies, with shouting and thrown plates. I sat down across from her at our kitchen table, the same table where we had eaten 1,000 ordinary dinners, and I asked her one question. I asked her to tell me her real name. I want you to imagine that moment for a second, because I still live inside it more than I live inside almost any other memory I have. The silence lasted so long I thought she might simply get up and leave the room. Instead, she put both hands flat on the table, looked at our children's drawings taped to the refrigerator behind me, and said a name I had genuinely never heard before in my life. What came out over the following hours was not a story I could have invented if I tried. The woman I married had left behind an entire previous existence roughly 8 years before we met, including a name, a family, and by her account, a controlling relationship she described as dangerous enough that she felt she had no choice but to disappear completely. She had built a new identity from pieces of real information, a real birth certificate obtained through a method she would not fully explain, a social security number that had belonged to someone else, and a biography stitched together from towns and schools she had researched carefully enough to survive casual conversation for 6 years. She told me she loved me. She told me the marriage was real, even if her name was not. I did not know, and still do not fully know, how much of that claim to believe. The days that followed were the strangest of my life. I had to explain to a lawyer that I was not entirely certain who my wife legally was. I had to consider what that meant for our marriage license, for our children's birth certificates, for every joint account and shared document with a name on it that may not have been hers to use. I remember sitting in a legal aid office being asked, with complete professional calm, whether I wanted to pursue an annulment, and realizing I had no framework in my head for answering that question, because nothing in my life had prepared me to consider that my marriage might not legally exist at all. If you have ever had a single conversation reorganize every assumption you've built a decade on top of, you understand exactly the floor dropping out from under me in that office chair. I want to pause here and ask you something directly, because this is the part of the story where I think about all of you watching. Have you ever discovered that someone close to you, a parent, a partner, even a lifelong friend, was not who they claimed to be? Not in a small way, but in a way that made you question the last several years of your own memory? I ask because for months I felt completely alone in this, convinced that no reasonable person could possibly understand a situation this specific. It was only later, once I started speaking to others, that I learned how many people carry some version of this same wound quietly, never mentioning it because they assume, like I did, that their story is too strange for anyone to believe. The legal process took the better part of a year. We did not divorce immediately, and I have thought many times since about why that is, why I stayed in the house with her for months after learning the truth. Part of it was the children, who were far too young to lose the only version of stability they knew. Part of it, if I am honest with myself, was that I still loved the person I had known for 6 years, even while learning that the name attached to that person was fiction. Grief does not respect legal categories. I was mourning a woman who was, in some sense, still sitting across the table from me every night. And that contradiction nearly broke something in me that I am still repairing today. During those months before the separation, I found myself doing something I never expected, which was defending her to people who had never even met her. My brother wanted to know how I could still share a roof with someone capable of that level of deception, and I remember struggling to explain that deception and character are not always the same thing, that a person can build a false name out of genuine fear and still be honest in every other way that mattered to our children. I am not certain I even convinced myself of that argument most days. But grief does not wait for you to finish sorting your feelings into neat categories before it demands you keep living. Keep making school lunches. Keep showing up to a job every morning as though your entire understanding of your own life had not just been rewritten in a bank parking lot. Eventually, we did separate, and the legal reality of our marriage was resolved in a way I will not detail here, both for privacy and because the specifics matter less than what I learned from them. What I learned is this: a lie can build a house strong enough to raise children in, strong enough to survive a decade of ordinary days, and still be built on absolutely nothing. I learned that trust is not the same thing as verification, and that for 6 years I had confused the two so completely I never noticed the difference. I do not say this to make you suspicious of everyone you love. I say it because somewhere between blind trust and constant suspicion, there is a version of attention I wish I had practiced far earlier than I did. People ask me now if I regret those 6 years, and the honest answer is more complicated than yes or no. I do not regret my children, who are the most real things to come out of any of it. I do not regret the ordinary tenderness of certain mornings, the laughter at the dessert table that started this whole story, because that laughter, whatever else was fiction, felt completely genuine to me at the time, and in some strange way I believe it still was. What I regret is the years I spent afterward blaming myself for not seeing it sooner, as though love is supposed to come with a built-in polygraph. It doesn't. Nobody's does. If you take one thing from this story, let it be that being deceived by someone skilled at deception is not a character flaw in the person who trusted them. I think about the version of me sitting in that bank parking lot for 2 hours, unable to drive home, and I feel something close to compassion for him now, which took a long time to arrive at. He was not stupid. He was not careless. He was a man who believed the woman across from him at dinner every night, because believing her was the natural human response to 6 years of shared mornings, shared bills, shared children, shared grief over a dead parent, shared everything that makes a life feel solid. The lie was sophisticated because the love inside it, on her side and mine, was not fake at all. That is the part most people cannot understand until they have lived through something similar themselves. And it is the part one most needed someone to tell me back when I needed it most. If this story affected you the way I hope it did, I want to ask you to do something small before you go. Tell me in the comments if you have ever discovered a truth about someone close to you that reorganized everything you thought you understood, because I read every single comment on these stories, and I want to know I am not the only one who has lived through something like this. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, consider doing that now, because we tell true stories exactly like this one every week. Stories about the ordinary people behind extraordinary secrets. The kind of stories that remind you that the people around you are always more complicated than they appear at the dinner table. 6 years is a long time to live inside someone else's carefully built fiction, but it is also a long time to build real memories, real children, and a real understanding of what it means to love someone even after the ground shifts beneath you. I am not the same man who stood under that wooden arch and promised to know his wife completely. I know now that none of us ever fully know anyone. That certainty is a comfortable illusion we build to help ourselves sleep at night, and that the only honest promise any of us can make to another person is to keep looking, keep asking, and keep loving them anyway, even when the truth turns out to be nothing like what we expected. That is the promise I try to keep now, imperfectly, every single day.